Currently, Bernie Madoff is in jail, serving a life sentence for committing the biggest financial crime in history. Madoff is well known for stealing $64.8 billion from 35,000 victims. Now the lawyers who represent more than 1,600 people robbed by Madoff have written a book about how this fraud was allowed to go on for decades. Joining us today is Helen Davis Chaitman, an attorney and the co-author of JPMadoff, the unholy alliance between America's biggest bank and America's biggest crook. Welcome, Helen. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start off by asking you, please tell me about the new book and why did you decide to co-author JPMadoff?
I decided to write this book because I wanted to protect the American public from future Bernie Madoffs. I've suffered with my clients who lost their life savings. I represent a retired New York City police officer who was in the rescue squad at 9/11. I represent a retired school teacher who lives in Florida. These are average, honest, hardworking people who lost their life savings. And yes, they lost their life savings because of Madoff. But Madoff would have been a small-time crook had he not had the backing of America's biggest bank. JPMorgan Chase recognized that Madoff was committing crimes in the early 1990s, and instead of shutting him down and reporting him to the federal government, JPMorgan Chase just made sure that it could make money off Madoff's criminal activity, and they kept his business alive for 20 years.
Wow.
And they made a fortune on it. Madoff, in order to keep JPMorgan Chase happy, kept billions of dollars with a B on deposit at the bank. In the old days, you'd get a toaster if you opened a bank account with $5,000. Well, what do you get if you keep $3 to $5 billion with a B dollars at JPMorgan Chase? You get the bank's support and complicity, and that's what happened.
Well, tell me, the cover says that the book is going to shock people. Is that part of the shock, that the banks went along with this?
It's not only went along with it, they allowed it to happen, and they had a complete view of what was going on. They saw every check that Madoff deposited. They knew that the Upstate Plumbers New York Pension Fund was invested in Madoff, and they knew that Madoff wasn't buying securities with the money. In fact, he was leaving it on deposit at JPMorgan Chase so that JPMorgan Chase could speculate with it.
So, Helen, understanding what happened, explain to me, how was Madoff and his bank able to go undetected for so long and conceal his criminal activities?
Well, JPMorgan Chase had a responsibility under the Bank Secrecy Act to report his activities to the federal government. They didn't do that, and that's why they pled guilty to 2 felonies. But the problem is that if the government is not going to put criminal bankers in jail, they're just going to stay at JPMorgan Chase and victimize other customers. And the book is chock full of facts as to how they have done this, not just with Madoff victims. They've done it with veterans. They've done it with consumers. They've done it with homeowners. There's no group of American consumers that JPMorgan Chase is not willing to victimize in order to enrich itself. And this book lays it all out.
Well, speaking of the book, it details a number of laws that were broken. What were some of those laws, and why was no one at the bank prosecuted?
The laws that were broken were the Bank Secrecy Act, which required the bank to close out someone who was using the bank for criminal purposes. They have violated the criminal antitrust laws by fixing LIBOR, the London Interbank rate. They have violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by hiring high government officials in China, the children of such government officials, in order to get business. That's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The fact of the matter is there isn't any law they're not willing to break if they can make enough money by doing it.
Well, why do you...
And the book lays all of this out.
Okay, so Helen, why do you say that the Obama legacy will be too rich to jail?
Because Obama has done a tremendous disservice to the American public by not prosecuting criminal bankers. There is not a single banker that has gone to jail since 2008 when Obama was elected, and yet they have committed massive crimes. Instead, what the government does is just takes a fine from them. Well, if you take a fine from a bank which has profited from criminal activity, and you don't take the people who committed the crimes and put them in prison, what happens? They get assigned to perpetuate a new crime. And criminal activity is very profitable. We learned that from the mafia. But that's why we've enacted the RICO statute to prosecute the heads of criminal organizations. And that's what the government needs to do in order to protect the public in the future.
Well, Helen, speaking of the future, how many of the victims, if any, how much of money have they been able to recover from this incident?
Well, very little. The total losses of 35,000 people were $64.8 billion with a B. And the total recovery has been $10 billion, so it's roughly 16 cents on the dollar. It's not very much.
Not at all.
The way to protect yourself is to read the book and know what the risks are before you put your money in a Wall Street bank.
Absolutely. Okay.
And the book is available, of course, on Amazon.com.
You knew that was my next question. Where can we find the book? Amazon.com. And, of course, more information also available at Amazon.com. Do you have a website where we can check in with you and learn more?
I do. JPMadoff lays it all out.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, folks, stay with us. We have more of Let's Talk Live coming up right after the break.